Well, if you're going to be an anchor man today, you better be ready to take the slings and arrows. And you also better be ready to get a laugh, too. And we'll show you how he did in just a moment. For now, give an NBC 30 Rockefeller welcome to CBS's own Dan Rather, right here. Crazy out there already. Now here. Well, it's not all Afghanistan, and it's not all horrible news. Believe it or not, the anchor men get out of the house, and once in a while, they're even able to get a laugh. Go get them, Dan Rather on David Letterman. Watch this.
But, you know, I got up in the mornings in a bad mood, and I shoved aside the breakfast tray. I had a quick cup of coffee, which tasted like 2-day-old transmission fluid or something. And so I hurriedly went out to the elevator, and all the way down in the elevator, it was crowded. People were staring at me. And I sort of said to myself, didn't anybody tell these people that it was rude to stare?
It's offensive. It's impolite.
Got down, one woman hung back. She came up and said, Mr. Rather, I hate to intrude. So I'm saying to myself, well, if you hate to intrude, why are you?
Exactly.
Right?
Yes,
but
sir.
she was very nice about it. And then she looked both ways. She said, but I need to tell you something. She looked both ways. She said, your fly is unzipped all the way down and your shirt tail is sticking out.
It worked here, too. We should all be able to get laughs like that on Letterman, and that's what you better do when you go there. Dan Rather is here with a book titled The Camera Never Blinks Twice, following on his first book of almost the same title. We've asked to join us Howard Kurtz, who's the media reporter for the Washington Post. Well, holy cow, everybody's talking about media. You better not be in media, because if you are, nobody likes you. Let me revisit, Dan, if we may, your interview with the Vice President of the United States in I believe January of 1988. Right. He is running for the first time, or as Vice President, he's running for President with Ronald Reagan, the great communicator, about to say goodbye. Well, my dear, there's been very few media one-on-ones that have created this kind of an uproar. Tell me what you think of this. Here they are, live on the evening news. Dan Rather wants to know from George Bush, where were you during Iran scam? A very important question. Where was George? He says he was out of the loop. Come on, he was at 3 meetings in Israel. They go, oh, are you kidding me? Come on. Why isn't this an important question? Now, here comes the Vice President. He's bobbing and weaving. They're live on television, and he gets Dan, boy. Talk about a knee in the stomach. Watch this. Go get him.
Yes. The President himself has said he wants all the facts out. He gave up such things as even his own diary. Every principal, including Secretary Schultz, he gave up some of it.
Well, Dan, let's be careful here, because you're
yes, sir, I want you to be careful, Mr. Vice President, because
I will be careful, but I want to get my side of this out.
The problem here is that you repeatedly said in the meetings, you said in a meeting in which Secretary Schultz, in the most forceful way, registered his objections. And then you said you never heard anybody register objections.
If it was the most forceful way, I've heard George Schultz be very, very forceful. And if I were there and he was very, very forceful at that meeting, I would have remembered that. I don't remember that.
Then how do you explain that you can't remember it and the other people at the meeting say he was apoplectic?
Maybe I wasn't there at that point.
You weren't in the meeting?
I'm not suggesting. I'm just saying I don't remember it.
I don't want to be argumentative, Mr. Vice President.
You do, Dan.
No,
this is not a great night, because I want to talk about why I want to be president, why those 41% of the people are supporting me.
And Mr. Vice President, these questions are
judge a whole career. It's not fair to judge my whole career by a rehash on Iran. How would you like it if I judged your career by those 7 minutes when you walked off the set in New York?
They were mad at him. They were mad at Rather. And Howard, you straight people, so-called mainstreamers, never followed up. You reported on the process. I don't know whether you did, and I don't think you were media critic at the time. But everything was, why was Dan Rather impolite to the Vice President? There was no even curiosity about whether or not Bush was in the loop during Iran scam.
Kind of a dramatic story, Phil.
Well, why was there no follow-up is my question.
Well, there had been...
You're the ones that are accusing us of tabloid television. I'm almost through, Howard. You're the ones, you sit there with your word processors and all these tabloid guys, and you don't follow the good news. You follow the tabloid issue here.
There had been hundreds of stories written in newspapers about Iran-Contra at that point, and it was defined by Bush and others as being old news. Dan Rather made it new news again in 1988.
Yeah, but why would you accept the vice president's declaration that it was old news? Why don't you make your own judgment about what's news? Don't let the people making the news decide what you should write or follow up or investigate.
I think in that case we did, but basically the public didn't care. This is a story that we hit and
So
hit
you're
and hit
driven by the popularity of the stories that you cover then?
Increasingly that's the case, not only in television, but in newspapers.
So you're not following
as well.
your own news head, you're following the contemporary winds of the time.
We are very worried about being hip, about being hot, about not losing readers and viewers, and that's why some of this tabloid fever, Phil, is infecting our part of the business as well.
Really? Don't tell me you guys are going to hell too.
I knew you'd be shocked.
Dan, you apparently, after this interview, just one more, you do appear to be abrupt here, but you've got somebody in your ear saying, wrap it up, wrap it up. You're 9 minutes into this live broadcast, am I correct?
That's right, which is an eternity when you only have 21.5 minutes,
right,
which is how long the evening news lasts.
Yes.
Phil, I appreciate you bringing this up. Look, I made some mistakes that day.
What were the mistakes?
You can't do it. You can't do live television. Well, I wish I had ended it in a more gentle fashion.
Yeah.
But the key thing here was we had sent thousands of our best missiles to the Ayatollah Khomeini. I thought George Bush would want to answer the question. When he didn't, I did think that newspaper people and others would pick up on George Bush says George Shultz is lying. One of these two people is not telling the truth about how those missiles got to the Ayatollah, but I was wrong.
Most striking were Bush's diaries with admission of much greater knowledge of the Iran-Contra affair than he'd ever publicly avowed. And then Dan Rather writes in his book, the fact is, he lied.
That's an unfortunate fact, but it is a fact. And I want to underscore here that I've known George Bush for now more than 30 years, and I respected him, I liked him. I didn't respect the fact that that day, that evening, he chose to lie. George Shultz was telling the truth. Yeah. George Bush was not telling the truth. He was running for president, and those who like George Bush, and I understand that, can say, well, he was running for president, so he had to do it. Exclamation point. I don't think so. I think he would have been better off to tell the truth.
But here we have, and incidentally, I don't see you as a guy who shoots from the hip. If anything, you know, you want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt here. And you write in your book here, the fact is, the vice president lied.
Well, the record now clearly shows that he did. We didn't know that in January 1988.
Yeah, but there was no enthusiasm on the part of the rest of the press to pursue the same kind of inquiry. It was less important, apparently, to Kurtz and all those other guys out there. He's here, so I got to abuse him. It's less important that the Ayatollah Khomeini, who incidentally presided over the bombing of the Marine billet, did he not?
Exactly.
241 Marines sleeping in their bunks are killed by a terrorist bomber who has been sent by God, Allah, and the Ayatollah, and now we're doing business with this guy, we're selling him, and people don't care that he lied, they care about your demeanor, Dan.
Well, that's what some people call, I myself would call it, the Hollywoodization of the news, the sleazing of the news, where you are more interested in the personalities, the celebrities, if you will, and the atmospherics than the substance. Exactly the point. I could not believe that George Bush would have any part of a secret operation that would send the Ayatollah Khomeini all these missiles after he blew 241 of our best people to smithereens.
I could see it on your face. I believed you. I shared your indignation. Sure, we want to say it'd be nice if we didn't have time and people screaming in the ear. What I'm asking Howard Kurtz to address is that there was no follow-up to this very important story. There was no follow-up to the fact that the press was held behind a rope during the Persian Gulf War. The most shameless kind of manipulating by the Pentagon of a press corps in the history of war, and there was no follow-up. We are, all of us, wimps. We're afraid of our circulation and our ratings, and we want to be popular, and if we decide that the people don't care that the Vice President of the United States lied, then we aren't going to report the story. Bad, bad, bad.
Yes?
Isn't that so? Don't you agree?
I think that we have gotten caught up, as Dan says, in an era of celebrity journalism, this age of OJ, and we do get very easily distracted, particularly at campaign time, by whatever's the flap du jour, whether it's Jennifer Flowers, whether it's the draft, I didn't inhale. That tends to make the headlines, not things like Iran-Contra. That's a fact of journalistic life.
Yeah. You tell your reader, Dan, in your book, that after this very eventful, tense encounter between you and the Vice President live on the evening news, incidentally, it wasn't 7 minutes, and it wasn't New York, was it?
No.
It was Miami, and how long was it?
It was 6 minutes.
Oh, okay.
By the way he got that, a staff member, Roger Ailes, that merry prankster, he was doing his job.
He was holding up cue cards.
He was holding up cue cards for the Vice President to read off of, and he made a mistake and said it was 7 minutes and it happened in New York.
Yeah.
But here's the point, I think, very quickly,
okay,
that any politician these days running for national office has a tremendous apparatus around him to spin everything,
yes,
and they spun that interview. And when Howard says, in effect, it's a lack of guts. You say, why is this happening? I think it's a lack of guts.
I do too.
All of us are scared to death that the ratings or circulation are going to go down, and so we just follow the herd. And if the herd says, listen, it's more important the atmospherics than the substance, that's the way it comes out of newspapers as well as television reports.
For better or for worse, I take satisfaction in saying that I have not lost touch with what I believe are the fundamentals of journalism. That thought was going to have to carry me for a while. I believe that others in the media, doesn't say it here, but I would say, like Howard Kurtz and the people at the Washington Post, would follow up on the questions I had tried to ask. I was dead wrong. As the wire services moved their stories, the focus was not on the missiles on the Ayatollah, the evasions of Iran-Contra. They were getting into the ins and outs of network television, whether George Bush had been badgered and treated with disrespect. And then you tell us something else. After this interview, and you finally wrapped it up, his mic was open. And do I understand that this could be heard, these comments?
Yes.
This is
not on the air. We were off the air, but these comments could be heard.
So somewhere there must be a tape of this.
There is.
The Vice President, after you finally finish this thing, here's what he says. The bastard didn't lay a glove on me. And then he said something else. Speaking about you, he is you. He makes Leslie Stahl look like a pussy. The Vice President of the United States said this.
Yes, he did.
You did not get very well reviewed by Time.
I didn't realize Time had reviewed it. I'm not surprised.
Well, no, but
you mean this and this. Well, among other things, Time magazine had someone covering George Bush who was trying to get a job with George Bush. The person covering George Bush for Time magazine wanted to be the White House press secretary for George Bush.
His name is David Beckwith.
That's true.
And he helped write the story in Time's community journalism way.
And surprise, he took George Bush's viewpoint for the most part.
Sure he did. And he also later on became the press secretary for Dan Quayle.
That's right. He thought he was going to be the press secretary for George Bush. He got aced on that, and so he got the second prize, which would be press secretary for Dan Quayle.
Dan Rather is joined by Mort Krim, who's the senior news anchor at WDIV TV4 in Detroit, Michigan. You are no greenhorn yourself here, Mort, fellow gray-headed...
Almost as white as you.
Oh, you're trying to catch up with me. Well, guess what? WDIV TV in Detroit, one of America's most powerful stations in a very large market, has decided to do a... first of all, you think sensational news has become the norm. Do I understand your position on our journalistic agony?
If I didn't, I'd be the only person in America who didn't.
You think so?
I think so.
Yeah. Evidence by what? Like, what would be an example of a sensational story that you think?
Well, I think sensationalism frequently, Phil, is not so much the substance as it is the style. I think the New York Times or the Washington Post can take the O.J. Simpson story and present it in a way that it's not sensationalized. I'm not saying they always do. And the National Enquirer or the Sun or the Weekly World can take that same story and it'll be sensational. The substance is the same, but the treatment is entirely different.
Right. You did report the Bobbitt story, I'm sure.
Bobbitt, I think I've heard of that.
Did you report it, though, Mort? You did report it.
Yes, we did.
Yes.
Yes.
And the Menendez brothers, you reported that.
Of course we did.
Uh-huh.
Yes.
Now, is that a tabloid story?
Can be.
So it's how it's presented, then?
I think it's how it's presented. I think those kinds of stories define your newscast as tabloid if they squeeze out more important issues such as education, the environment, politics, things that really affect people's lives.
Now, you're here because you have inaugurated a segment of your newscast titled Above and Beyond. Now, is this every night at 11?
Every Friday at 11.
Oh, every Friday, above and beyond. How
We
long?
have to start with little bites. We can't shock the public too much.
All right.
But,
What is the point here? What does this mean, above and beyond?
For several years, Phil, I did a segment on Friday nights called Tabloid Tales, in which I would go out and buy all the tabloid papers, take the most bizarre stories, and then satirize them. And we ran music under them, and it was like our Friday night kicker.
Right.
And one day I woke up and I said, you know, the front end of the show looks so much like Tabloid Tales, it's not satire anymore. And so I went on the air and did a commentary one night in the normal position where we did Tabloid Tales, and I said, folks, I'm not doing this anymore. From this point on, we're going to dedicate this time slot to reporting on the heroes in our community. Right. The people who are creating basketball leagues for inner city youth, the people who are the doctor who makes hot dogs on Sunday.
You like it? Well, it's about time we got a hand for somebody in media today. Well, we're foursquare in favor of what you're doing, Mort. But it sounds a little wimpy to me. It sounds like you're saying to your viewers in Detroit, please don't be mad at us. Here's the good news. And we have to wonder what stories are not being reported because you've decided that they'll only offend the viewers because the viewer doesn't like negative news. Do you worry about that? I would ask a journalist of some standing from Detroit.
No, I have a lot of worries, Phil, but that's not one of them. I think there is a tremendous need, not just a desire, but a need in this country which has become cynical. We've gone beyond skepticism, and I think a lot of that is a reflection of what we journalists have become. A New York Times article 2 or 3 weeks ago, which I'm sure you saw, made the point that journalists are supposed to be skeptical. We've crossed the line. We've become cynical. We've decided that no politician, no business leader, no leader in this country can have an altruistic motive or do anything for the right reasons. They're all out there with an angle. They're all out there to scam us. I don't believe that. And I think in order to give the public a genuine view of life, we have to tell the rest of the story.
What do you think?
I applaud what Mort is doing, but I do think, with all respect, and I'm not so sure that Mort would disagree with it, the problem is not with the politicians. The problem is not in the stars. The problem is with us. We've lost our backbone. We've lost our guts. We've lost that part of inside ourselves.
How is this manifesting itself, then?
Well, it's manifesting itself that we are time after time, we're doing two things. One, we fold when the going gets tough. Some politician says, stop doing that or I'm going to ruin your reputation. And you say, oh, by all means, don't ruin my reputation. And the second thing is that we follow the herd. If everybody says the Bobbitt is the story, everybody leads with Bobbitt, everybody goes with Bobbitt. If Menendez is the story, everybody goes with O.J. Simpson. Great story, but you and I know, Phil, this being overcovered. What's happening in the news business, and I do not accept myself nor CBS, is what is happening somewhat in the talk show business. That somebody puts on a cross-dressing nun from the planet Uranus or something.
You had that show on here, didn't you?
Next week, it's a two-parter.
Their ratings spike, and somebody says, listen, Dan, Phil, Mort, you better pick up on the new steps, because if you don't, your ratings are going to go down and you get out of business. And instead of saying, stick it in your ear, I'm not going to do that, we say, well, you got a point, and I wouldn't do it just that way, but stay tuned, we'll begin to do some of this stuff. That's the problem.
Are you moved to make an observation, Mr. Kurtz?
Didn't you feel uncomfortable therefore, Dan, a couple weeks ago when CBS Evening News led with Connie Chung's interview with Faye Resnick, Nicole Simpson's supposed friend? She's out peddling a book. You don't know if what she alleges in there is true. I don't know if it's true. I don't think Connie knows whether it's true, and you devote the top part of your broadcast to that. Wasn't that following the herd?
Well, one, I'm not, good point. I would point out that the Washington Post has done much the same thing. The Washington Post ran with the Bobbitt story on the front page day after day after day.
I know exactly my newspaper from the city.
You've asked me about something we did. One, I'm not the vice president in charge of making excuses. Two, I'm not the person to pass judgment on what Connie Chung does or doesn't do, because she's a friend of mine, she's a colleague of mine. I believe in her intentions and her idealism. Now, but you used a specific example, and the Simpson case in general is a perfect example of what Phil is talking about. Yes, it's a great story. Yes, it's an interesting story. Yes, we should be covering it, but not to this extent. We all are over-covering it.
It's on 47 news magazines.
And we're going with stories that we know are unsourced or
Phil,
badly sourced, and we're doing it for one reason, and that is to spike the rating.
There's another issue here, too, that I think we need to look at, and it's the economics of news coverage, and it's particularly true at the local level. We have cut down the size of our news departments to where it's easier and cheaper to get the police blotter story. We scan our police radios.
Yeah.
A crime story is easy and cheap. An investigative story, a story that deals with positive things in the community,
more expensive,
that takes effort,
and can lead to a
find.
dead end. May I be the only person in America that thinks that CBS News ought to lead with the Resnick book? If the closest female associate of a deceased woman is saying that her husband, she was concerned that her husband was going to kill her, I think that's news. And her credibility has held up. And in fact, the book was so incendiary that it almost caused Judge Ito to throw everybody out of the courtroom. It's a good story, and Connie Chung should be commended for getting it. And what's wrong with it? Why does it bother you, Howard?
I think, first of all, the author's credibility is still an open question. And secondly, is that the most important thing that happened in the world that day? It was more important than health care, the deficit, or Bosnia, or anything else?
John Culleton, General Manager of WCCO Television in Minneapolis, you are editing the film of the 5 o'clock news with children in mind. Do I understand this?
Children and other adults who came forward to us after several months of discussion and said, do you need to do what you're currently doing? And we changed.
Here's your news director, who recently got another job. I believe he's en route to Chicago, explaining the change. Now, remember the Hebron massacre. A man walks in with a machine gun and slays many, many people. And here's how they reported it at 5 and then at 10. Tell us how you feel about this, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. CCO Minneapolis, watch.
Now, here are some examples of our family-sensitive approach to the 5 o'clock news. First, the recent story of the mosque massacre in Hebron. Here is our 5 p.m. version. This newscast shows video of the fighting and wide shots of February's mosque massacre. Little blood, no close-ups of bodies. A story that related more to the breaking information, looking for the appropriate pictures for a younger audience, not the overwhelming pictures. Here's our 10 p.m. version of that same story.
Be warned, these are some disturbing pictures we're about to show you. For those of you not familiar with the story, this morning a gunman entered a West Bank mosque during prayer services and opened fire with a machine gun and a handgun. This was the aftermath. Witnesses say surviving worshipers tackled and beat the gunman to death.
How does Mr. Kurtz feel about this?
I wonder, first of all, why it's, if you can get away with not showing it at 5 o'clock, why do you need to show it at 10 o'clock? Can you not tell the same story without giving us, you know, in this case, it's the foreign equivalent of the body bags?
You want to just get, you want the blood and you want the reality of the news out of there? You want to sanitize the bombing of the barracks in Lebanon, too?
I've just seen too many newscasts, Phil, where there are 3 murders and 2 rapes and 2 fires before you get to the weather, with lots of blood and guts that I find gratuitous.
If I could say this, the audience, which is the original generation for this, people like this, we had groups of meetings with people like all of you who told us, why can't you change? Why don't you realize that our children are watching television at 5 in the afternoon? We want change out of you. However, when confronted with the issue of the late news, they see it differently. So if in taking our cue from the audience, people said the late news can be different, and so that's how we arrived at the conclusion to separate the two.
But Howard, I am struck by your suggestion that we don't need to see the body bags at all. Not only at 5, but at 10 or 11 o'clock in Eastern time zones as well. Maybe you probably wouldn't have shown Morley Safer's report on My Lai or the thatched huts and the Zippo lighter. You probably wouldn't show the arriving bodies at Dover Air Force Base after skirmishes, military skirmishes in faraway lands. Don't show the people these terrible things.
What I'm tired of seeing, Phil, is night after night after night of bodies being loaded into ambulances and local shootings, of which in any big city you can junk up your top of your newscast with that in a way that after a while people are numb to it. And that's all I'm saying, is that we've overdone it, and that's why stations like CCO are moving in this direction.
Dan?
It's what we call in the news business the fuzz and the was, which is slang expression for the police, the fuzz, and the was, WZ, for people who used to be and are now dead. Look, there's a long tradition in American journalism of trying to increase your ratings by reporting on bloody things. I do I take a deep breath here because I have great respect for what they're doing in Minneapolis, but I do have reservations about it. I've spent a lifetime saying I don't believe in sanitizing the news. I think we can be sensitive without going so far as to say, you know, out there, they go into a mosque, they shoot up the mosque, but there's no blood, there's no body bags, it's all, you know, it's just sort of easy. I think the problem with violence on television, and there is a deep and abiding problem, is not a problem with violence on the news, whether it's at 5 o'clock, noon, or at 10 o'clock. The problem with violence on television comes in entertainment programs. And I question respectfully whether this approach, which in some ways I applaud, of being sensitive about children watching at that hour, can have any effect at all when what you have in the 100-channel, soon-to-be 500-channel world is overwhelmingly people shooting other people, cutting people's throats. The entertainment programs are the problem when it comes to violence in television, not the news programs.
But there is an issue. There is an issue of violence on the news, and I think you just touched on it. You said you're tired of seeing rape after rape, murder after murder, crime after crime.
As if it's the only thing going on.
It's balance. It's not that we are reporting things that are too violent. It's that we are reporting too much of them, and in the process, squeezing out other issues that are really important to the community.
I say amen to that.
You and 48 Hours, very successful program, to which you are more than passingly attached.
It's the most successful weekly documentary series in the history of television.
Phil,
Rush Springs, Oklahoma's quiet was shattered when two boys put a gun to their father's head and pulled the trigger. 48 Hours, August. Eric Smith, a teen who'd never been in trouble before, confessed to killing 4-year-old Derek Roby. Lewis Lint hunted children to kill. 48 Hours, an examination of the O.J. Simpson case. Till death do us part. Bianco died after her husband came back to get her after being sent to prison for repeated incidents of domestic abuse against the wife. So you do Fuzz and Was.
You bet we do, because we want to survive, for one thing. You cannot survive in prime-time programming without doing some of these programs. Now, we, like you, Phil.
But you didn't say that to the radio and television news directors.
Yes,
you said Fuzz and Was wrong.
That. I began the criticism with criticism of myself. And I included in it criticism of CBS and CBS News. We are all, to one degree or another, going this, what I call the gutless path. Listen, fear rules every newsroom in America.
I am pleased to introduce David Christian Hamblin, who is editor-in-chief of the World Times, the Good News newspaper. This is published in Albuquerque?
Santa Fe.
Santa Fe. And your circulation extends beyond our shores, does it?
That's true. We're international.
Yeah. And you put this together because you yourself were depressed at one time. Do I understand?
Yes, I was. Unlike the gentleman sitting up here, you can tell by the way we're dressed, I'm not a professional journalist. I had a business in upstate New York that during the recession went under after 5 years. And I went into a depression that I thought would just last maybe a few weeks. But indeed, it lasted about 1.5 years. And during that time, every time I would turn on the news and programs like 48 Hours, I would just, you know, feel helpless, like, why do I want to live on this planet? There's nothing to live for. And eventually, I was inspired to go out and do some research, find good news and human interest stories that were happening around the world. And indeed, I found a lot of stories that weren't being told. And
here's about a picture lead above the fold, a Pittsburgh heir who gave his fortune to care for the people of Haiti. Here is your second section. Doctors perform open-heart surgery on endangered baby orangutan. Now, there's a lead for you, Howard. Choosing Life, Awanza's Miracle Healing. An interview with Jamie Sams. All good news. A benefit concert for girl draws donations, attention. Enterprising 9-year-old becomes talk show celebrity. Is the news coming in over the transom? Have you got good news wires? How do you get them? No
it's
kidding.
on AP. A lot of these stories come off AP.
Right.
And we have reporters around the country and around the world that are writing human interest stories for us. And what I believe is that the truth has to be shown. Yes, we have to see the murders and the rapes and the incest stories, but I think we also have to see the other side of it.